To the airport?
No, she was at the airport about 30 minutes ago, but she was at the airport. So
Yeah,
she'll
I
be in her
guess
car.
Karen said that she wants us to call her, but she's not going to be in here, so
Working it out.
we will figure it out.
So we are streaming.
Excellent.
Yep. Well, that and I was able to get on the chair and get everything successfully turned on, so I'm just excited.
Okay, this
Are
is the
these
one
working, or are we just
No,
are
I'm
we
gonna
using
turn
these?
them both.
Okay.
They're on.
three numbers. I gotta make sure I know which-
The mics are on. Oh, maybe that one. I didn't get to that.
That's okay, that's no worries. Let me call you. That's okay, that's okay, I'll call you back.
Does this push magically somehow other than I'm pushing it?
Yeah.
Oh, it's on the bottom. Ah, okay, it's like one of Finn and JJ's toys. Gotta turn it on first. All right.
Several times to make sure.
Yeah.
We're expecting my other number.
So it's 5270 is on one.
I know.
Those pieces are supplemental and just add to the conversation when we get to. I tried to anticipate questions you all would ask, like, what do other districts do?
Thank you.
So,
Put the name plate there now.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Karen. Karen, do you have Maya's other number?
It's not the 5270 number.
It'll be a few months. I have to push it out for a while.
do you take electron tools? Did you want to?
I don't, and I don't.
Okay. Done.
Is it 0230?
I have it, her last four digits are 5270.
That's, yeah, it's not
That's the one I've got.
Now, that's her personal.
Yeah.
5270.
0230. This is what I'm calling now.
We'll see.
Let's try that.
Yeah, I was going to say there's.
Who am I calling?
Maya,
You have the right?
correct phone? Yes, 0230. Yes.
Okay, good.
I'll put you on speakerphone just 1 second. Just 1 second. Maya, can you hear it?
Here.
Okay,
Here,
you're
I'm here.
perfect.
Okay, wonderful.
Put it right by the microphone there. and-
Yeah, she's right by the mic, so
Okay.
she should be able to hear us, and we should be able to hear. So, all right. We're going to go ahead and call our work session to order tonight. So thank you for joining us. We have President Venkatachalam is joining us via phone. She's just returning from some travel, so welcome to her. And I believe we're still expecting Director Hardy to show up today, so we will bring him up to speed when he gets here. So, Dr. Watts, would you like to introduce tonight's work session, please?
Yes, I will. Thank you, Vice President Strauss, members of the board, Ms. Howley, staff and friends. I would like to call Dr. Jewel Harmon forward, and she is already forward, to provide a most recent update of our policy work. And this will be an opportunity for us to review and approve and read, and we look forward to a fruitful discussion. So, Dr. Harmon, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
So, good evening, Vice President Strauss, members of the board, Dr. Watts, Ms. Howley. We're here tonight to engage in a policy discussion and update around 10 policies. They are in order by kind of recency, so 6220 since it was most recently discussed. And then before we introduce first readings of new policies, there was one still out there that needed either some closure or continuation, which was 1610, I believe, or is it 1610? And so it's a fourth reading, but rather than continuing to add, wanted to try to get some closure around open policies. So that's why those two are there, and then the remainder are first readings. So we'll dive right into it.
Dr. Harmon, before we do, I just want to do a quick audio check. Maya, can you hear Dr. Harmon clearly? Maya, can you hear me?
I am on mute.
That's what I thought. That's all right.
I can hear Dr. Harmon fairly clearly.
Okay. Shall we have a mic closer to her? And if not, let us know, and we may need to move her right now. We'll start with the mic a little closer to her.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
So 6220 is our purchasing and contracting bids and contracts policy. The board, you all as a board have been working through this policy, and the last time it was shared, there were kind of three big takeaways, I think, what I heard. One was the procurement and public works, section F, and wanting to close that gap that was left open under the law. And what you'd asked is that we close that gap by requiring competitive bids at any amount higher than $75,000. And I apologize for being a stickler, but I didn't want to have any gray area, so I made it $75,001, so it is explicitly clear what that means. And so that closes that $25,000 gap, because otherwise that wouldn't start until $100,000. Because that was one thing that you'd asked. I added a sentence at the end to ensure that there was alignment with 6211. So regardless of the funding source or the bid process, the board still approves any purchases or expenditures over $25,000. So that does not change, and wanted to clarify that in this process. And then the last was that you asked about language reflecting activities where district staff took procedural action and not the board. And so there were instances where it says the board will develop a proposal for a request to bid. The board will do this. And so I changed that to district staff. I did retain, there was a section in there that talked about the board's approval process and the ability to exempt the process for certain causes, and I left that as the board's responsibility. I did not change that to district staff. And so those were the three substantive changes under 6220 that you'd asked to see. That's what is done and reflected with those track changes. And so that is what we are proposing move forward, and that you would see, if you agree, at a regular meeting for adoption and approval.
Any questions or comments on 6220?
No, no.
Maya, any questions on this, on 6220?
Maya, are you there?
She's unmuting.
She's
Unmuting.
unmuting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, it's hard.
Yeah, I do appreciate the work that you did on this, Dr. Harmon, of putting in the things. I think you did a really good job capturing what we had asked for, so thank you. All right.
So if there aren't any questions or changes to that, we'll move on to the next. Oh, so before we move forward, I want to be clear. So this will appear on the regular meeting on May 8th.
Right.
For discussion and approval. Okay. Just want to make sure what's happening.
So I have a question though.
Yeah, third reading and approval.
A third reading and
Yes.
approval. Okay, got it. Because I was going to say discussion. we could
Third
do
reading and approval.
Got it.
Rather, it could go on the consent agenda, but I would prefer that so then you don't have to pull it if you have another question or.
Got it. I know. I was going to say hopefully.
I hope not, but I don't.
Yes, yes.
So the next was policy 1610. And it was conflicts of interest, board and superintendent. And this one was brought forth because when the board was going through this kind of 6,000 series expenditure piece, it came up about conflicts of interest, and it seemed that we were kind of closing the door on all pieces except superintendent and board. And that seemed to be, especially superintendent, where you had some concerns and questions, and this policy is a place to kind of address that. And so that's why it was brought forward. One of the big changes here, there aren't any changes since you've last seen it per se. You just weren't ready at that time to adopt in December when it was last brought to you. One of the big things is that the policy number needs to align with WASDA model policy. So I would recommend that we make that change, even if we don't make any of the procedural or policy technical changes. There was some other language around statutory requirements about a director who has a remote interest to disclose information and have it recorded in the minutes. That is reflected in the new policy. It's not uncommon. It was kind of there, but it just states it explicitly now per WASDA model policy. And it clarifies the employment of a spouse as a substitute teacher, and for other open positions, whether it's a board member's spouse or it's the superintendent's spouse, meaning that they are allowed to be a substitute teacher. However, their placement and selection for a position has to be no different than any other substitute teachers. They're not allowed to have favoritism in the sites where they sub or any of those things. They're not allowed to have a different pay rate or any of those pieces. Similar with the employment as well. The one exception with the employment piece for a full-time position is that when the board acknowledges that this person would come on as an employee, they also have to take note that there were other qualified other qualified applicants, and that this person selected was the most qualified applicant, so that they're just doing that check for nepotism and favoritism based on familial relationship.
B is a little confusing, the first sentence, unless I'm confused, which could be, prior to approval of the employment of a director or spouse of a school director or superintendent. So what do you mean we say a director or spouse of a school director or so this is,
So that one, I think, is about the placement, depending on whether, so if it's related to a director, it is about whether or not the person was an employee before you were elected, or they're becoming and joining employment after you're elected. So,
but it doesn't speak to, so prior to approval of the employment of a director or spouse of a school director. So employment of a director as far as employment of a former director, or employment in the director position, or I'm not sure what that
so
means.
employment in the director position, there's a small earlier statute in that, or earlier line in that language that talks about a board member may be brought on as an employee of the district in a very specific instance. I'm sorry, let me pull it up.
So should it say a former director? Because it wouldn't be a current director.
So a current director can be an employee of the district.
Okay.
Under, I'm sorry, let me.
Because after that, it says a school director. This just says director. So if it is a school director, I think it should just clarify that so we know. Does that make sense? Because I wouldn't think necessarily, I know what it's implying.
Yes.
And isn't that geared more towards real small districts?
Yeah.
I mean, I think in a district our size, I'm not sure why, I mean, a small district with, 10 kids may have somebody who's a board director who's also the high school principal or something. But I don't know how it would ever apply here.
Well, just because it doesn't apply
Doesn't
or
mean it
couldn't
can't be
apply doesn't mean that it shouldn't be cleared up. And
Okay.
so if the language needs to be cleared to state,
Because that is what it means, right? That's what it means?
Yes.
Okay, so I think, yeah, that was just, because I know there are other director positions that are, you know what I'm saying?
yes,
So-
it's not an administrative
Right,
director
that's
position.
what I'm
It is a
saying.
school
It's
board
school
director
So I
position.
think that should just be, that should be put in front of it.
And so what we're saying is on C, we would change it to be, D, prior to the approval of the employment of a school director or spouse of a school director or superintendent.
Yes, and I actually see that same thing in C as well. It starts out similarly with the spouse of a director or the superintendent may be employed as a substitute teacher. And so it seems as if WASDA model policy fluctuates between using school board director and just director interchangeably. And so we can make it consistent and say school
Since
board
we do
director.
have director, staff.
Right, there's
positions.
staff that are
Yes.
directors, yeah, because it says it in B2, an individual director.
I think
So
that
just to
would-
clarify that it's
that would
school
help
director, I
clarify.
think would be helpful.
That's good.
And if you wanted to see where our current policy looks like, so President Vengadaslam, I did email you these, the handouts that they're looking at if you wanted to see. The first handout that I'm referencing is just our current policy around conflicts of interest for board. And like I said, the WASDA model policy update just gives more detail and attempts to clarify some of the things that were just left up to interpretation.
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to review. I just got it at 5:36, I think.
It's our current policy, so it's just as a matter of comparison of how different the changes are. And so it really speaks to just clearly defining and laying out the 5 instances where there could be conflict of interest based on mostly employment is what it's trying to correct. But it does speak to financial interest in district purchases and decision-making. And it also says that it speaks to board members having to abstain from taking an action around employment-related decisions. So for example, if you have a family member that is a teacher in the district and it's time to vote for the salary schedule or something like that, then the board member would not vote on that particular item.
And our current policy is actually more restrictive than this policy. So our current policy was the one that started out saying that, just for Maya's sake, since she can't see it, that spouses or relatives who reside in the same house as the superintendent or board members will not be considered for employment in the district unless they were employed before the date of the board, that the board member or the superintendent took office. So that was our policy in the past, is it didn't allow for the 5 exceptions. It was just cut and dry. They would not be considered. So. I have one question in regards to A and B. To me, still seem to be in direct conflict of each other, and maybe it's just my reading it, but A says that you won't have any monetary interest directly or indirectly with any contract purchase or paid activity, but then B says that you may be designated as a clerk or a purchasing agent at prevailing wage.
So this is one of those things that is attempting to address, I suppose, issues with smaller districts where you may be a staff member and a board member, or you may have to, as board member, take on certain other responsibilities for the district. It is not typical practice in larger districts to have board members be salaried, even part-time salaried employees. It is something that we don't have to have that if that's a concern. We can have board members have no wage or employment opportunities within the district.
Yeah, I understand the WASDA policies are made for everybody,
they are.
big and
Right,
little.
right.
And some of the things that are in our policies are definitely made for little districts, and I don't think they belong in our policy. So, my opinion, so I.
So it'd be
I-
taking B out, basically.
Yeah,
Yep.
I would be
Oh,
taking
yeah,
B
that was the
out.
thing I would say, strike B then. I think
Yeah.
that's what
I was like, it sounds like what I'm hearing is that we want to remove B.
Yeah.
Okay.
Easier to create one model policy for school
Yeah.
district from 53,000 to 6, I think is our smallest school district.
Yeah.
That's good.
Anything else on 1610?
Do we have, it has to do with F, and I guess, one on F and one on the last sentence. The one on F just has to do with the term remote. It talks about having remote interest. I don't know what's defined as, I don't know if there is a WASDA model definition of remote interest, saying that, oh, it's okay if they have, because basically it's saying, there's A, which I would read as A, no monetary interest in anything. But F says a remote interest is okay, but doesn't necessarily, to my knowledge, clarify what remote means.
So there's not any additional piece related to that. We can define.
Point of clarification, the reference to RCW 4223040 in the header there.
Can you come up this way?
Yes.
Thank you.
Get close to the mic.
Yeah.
Hi Maya, this is Tim. Looking at the header of that policy, it references RCW 42.23.040, which is actually the definition of remote interest under
Okay.
state law.
So a standard definition under state law.
Exactly,
Okay, I
yeah.
think that's likely sufficient. Okay, then the only other question was, the last thing is kind of a directive, maintaining it forward and I don't know, put resources around whatever it takes to do that. Scope that. Do we do that currently?
So maintaining along any contracts or something.
That was all.
Okay, I'm good.
Karen? Maya? Are you good?
I'll have to review that again, so I need to be excused on that particular one. We can move on.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, great. All right. So,
So-
1610.
So 1610 will reflect the striking of B, the consistent language of school board director throughout the policy, and a little bit of clarification around the creation of law, but recognizing that that's procedural more than policy, but yes. And it will show up in discussion and approval, but that will give you the opportunity to have it to approve if you choose, but also continue the discussion if need be.
Okay, thank you.
So this one was one of my favorites.
I know, it's fun. Service animal's fun.
It is. It is.
I know.
It
The
is.
small
It could be a
horse.
horse.
It is one of those interesting, just kind of works in the legal, or yes. So in this particular instance, we're referring to service animals in schools. It is policy 2030. It reflects mostly changes in substitute House bill or adoption of substitute House bill 2822. And it clarifies kind of service animal misrepresentation. So across the nation, there's become kind of tighter rules around what qualifies as a service animal and what that means. And so the substitute House bill here also provided penalty to the civil infraction if you misrepresent your animal as a service animal. So that was interesting. And it then includes that language there. We added, of course, that clarifying language, and it is any dog or miniature horse. Those are the only options. So any dog, it does not specify a particular breed or any of those things. It does not allow space for any other type of animal other than a miniature horse. It does, however, clarify, though, what type of work that animal needs to do, and that's what's most important. I think so. As much as people would like to debate the other pieces, it makes it very clear that this animal is here to provide support that is work that is related to an individual's disability. So that's the other piece that's emphasized here that's important, is about the aiding in the disability status. And then it also corrects the language of what it is not. So if the animal's presence is of a provision of emotional support, well-being, comfort, or companionship, that does not constitute work. So under this definition, that is not a service animal.
I think it's interesting, though, that they don't have to provide any proof or documentation, or I just think it's interesting.
So I think, so it does talk about having to have some consultation with their building principal.
I see.
And it has to be if it's student related to their 504 plan.
Well, yes, but it's not, I mean, you can't ask about the quality, you can't ask about the why, there's no required documentation that that the animal is a trained service animal. I mean, it's just interesting, that's all, that there's no proof that's required. I just thought it was interesting.
That one where the principal shall not
The whole
require
paragraph.
documentation.
Yeah, the whole paragraph.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of, it's because you're dealing
It's
with a protected class of individuals.
No, I get that, yeah.
Yes.
So then
And
I
so it's
wonder
kind
about
of
the
this
penalty, though.
balance.
How do you find out if there's do you know what I'm saying? It's like almost contradicting that, it's just an interesting way that they've done it with the law, saying there'll be a penalty, but they don't have to prove, so anyway, it's just interesting, that's all.
Are we aware of any students that would be impacted from this, meaning have a non-dog or non-miniature horse
Potbelly
service
pig.
animal?
Little pigs.
Okay.
Pigs don't count.
No,
smart.
no known current 504 plans that, I have no idea if someone's gonna say, hey, tomorrow, you can no longer bring your pig or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Not to my knowledge. I do say that we get occasional requests.
Yeah, but increase, yeah.
And this makes it easier to lean on policy and
Okay.
refer to the law to say, this is the case. And if they have a disability, this will not be unfamiliar to them. So if
Gotcha.
a person has an established disability, they are aware, and if they've gone through the process of getting their service animal trained and all of those things, none of this is an issue, should not be.
Yeah.
And so it should not impact negatively any student or staff member.
Is something like anxiety attack considered a psychiatric disability?
Anxiety, it's a disorder.
Is it?
Panic disorder, they have anxiety.
Okay, so that would be allowed, so that's an
Could rise
emotional
to
thing,
the-
but
to the
it's,
realm of
It's a
Yeah.
physical,
disability.
it's
Yeah.
also
Okay.
physical, though, yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
good.
So that then is now stepping outside of school district kind of policy pieces and getting into the determination of a medical professional of whether or not they are then writing this and kind of codifying it on their side.
Right.
Because at this point, if their doctor says that they have a medical necessity that constitutes a disability and it requires a service animal,
That's all, you just do it.
we pretty much don't argue that piece, as long as it is a dog or a miniature horse.
And directly related to.
And directly related to
They're
serving
supporting-
that particular
supporting that,
disability.
Yeah,
Yeah,
supporting that.
yeah.
Mhm.
I think
What dog?
Question is
Therapy dogs.
therapy dogs?
Therapy dogs.
So not if their primary work is well-being, comfort, or companionship. That is not defined under policy or law as the work of a service animal. So it would have to be specifically related to diagnosed anxiety or some other piece. And that is what they're serving as a disability, is the distinction here.
Right, but this only speaks to service animals. It doesn't speak to a teacher bringing in a dog to help her class. It only speaks to service animals. They're two separate issues.
Right.
So she was saying, and it doesn't apply, so I don't know that it would. If a teacher, principal decided to let teachers bring a dog into class,
No, I think
Yeah.
it's an important question. And the distinction, and as I read and understand this policy, as has been enacted in various school districts, miniature horse, dog, that is the standard. Supporting the disability of said student. The difference would be, think about classroom pets or things of that nature. We look at our current practices, but I do believe that we would respond on a case-by-case basis. Much like the airlines news that we often hear, someone claims that they have a need for a service animal in the form of a crocodile.
Chinchilla.
Yeah, absolutely. Or
yeah,
some other animal that would not necessarily be safe,
yeah,
reasonably safe within a school setting.
yeah. Yeah, but I think this specifically speaks to the definition of a service animal. It doesn't speak to therapy dogs or people bringing, it doesn't speak to that. So that's why I said it's two separate issues.
Similar and separate.
Yeah.
So this then creates the space, depending on how far the board is interested in carrying that particular piece, and a cross-referencing policy. That is slightly outside the scope of WASD model policy, but that's the board's discretion. We could do, for example, like a 2031 that speaks to therapy animals or other things if the board wants to go down that path of kind of defining more of that or putting some structures around that if we choose.
And a question.
I mean, but it
I don't
is.
know why we would. I mean, yeah.
I'm not suggesting that you do, but I'm just saying
Yeah,
if you're interested in
yeah.
going that route, depending on how far you want to go with this.
To that question, and you may or may not have this answer, but I'm curious to know, to your knowledge, are you aware of any teachers or staff who are in need of such support or service through therapy?
Well, I do know that at Kentwood and at Kentridge, there were teachers and volunteers who are interested in bringing that program into the classroom, particularly to work with our special education students. So I don't know what status that initiative is in, if there's been any support or lack of support from the district on it. But this policy might not be addressing it, but it might be something we should consider.
Absolutely.
It might be related.
Thank you. And that's helpful, that context, Supervisor, so we can certainly follow up on at least those two schools, but at a broader level, ask if there are other instances.
When I was in Issaquah, our OT at my school had a therapy dog, and the district after a while said, no therapy dogs, no dogs at all. So I think because there are some children who are frightened of dogs, there are some children who are
allergies,
allergic to
right,
dogs.
All those pieces.
You know,
Yeah.
so.
So we can still certainly follow up and just get a sense of.
Check and see if what other districts do too.
Thank you.
So in regards to 2030, any other questions on this one?
I don't have any.
Head shaking, no? Okay. So then this one would be on,
May 8th, second reading and approval. And I hear that there are some more procedural process questions that require an update, but not necessarily substantive changes to policy. The 3143, and I am sure that Mr. Heath is very excited that these are on the agenda. So we're getting into our 3000 series, and this starts with district notification of juvenile offenders. And so this revision groups together language about different sources of notification. The edits don't do significant altering of the provisions of the policy, but they clarify that districts have a responsibility to act when they receive certain notifications, regardless of the source of those notifications.
So inhaling toxic fumes is on there twice.
Just a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just noticed that inhaling toxic fumes is on there twice, bullet point 3 and bullet point 7-ish, 8?
Oh, it is, yes, and no, it's not emphasized for any particular reason.
And these are offenses, these are things listed out in the laws, like these are the names of the offenses, the type, I suppose.
Yes, so in previous reference, they referred to the RCW
Gotcha.
in the policy, and now they're called out
The
as
individuals.
activities.
Yep.
And so that's the change, the biggest change there, but I will remove that duplication act.
I didn't have any comments on this one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't think I did either.
Anybody else, any comments on this one or questions?
There's, under the notification for Department of for DSHS, there seems to be like, because there's this whole thing about making sure that the offender's not enrolled in the same schools, but it seems to be two different organizations that aren't the school district deciding that, DSHS and JRA. And so is that gonna be done outside of the individual principals or district's decision? Or is that, and then moved around? How would that work? Just because it's not clear here.
In my experience, it is decided before they come back to school, only in the sex offender areas. It is decided before, the school doesn't have a lot to do with it.
Okay, so the school doesn't have a lot to do with it.
No, it's decided, it's actually part of the court order, those types of things, it's part of that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Other questions on this one? Karen?
So the principal and the teachers who are going to be working with said student will know what the status is.
So that gets into the next policy.
Mm,
And actually,
okay.
so it's
Yeah, I
interesting when
read that, yeah.
WASA updated both of these, they kind of created the update and the language around the updates together.
Okay.
And so that's next on the list, and it talks about who has a right and a need to know. And we'll get there in just a second, but yes.
Okay.
I do have a question, though.
Okay, Randy, can you take this?
It's actually any staff member that has a need to know, and that's more clearly delineated in the procedures as
Okay.
well. And so what they were finding, this has always been in place. There was an audit that was done at both court level and at the school level around the state that tried to understand, was this being complied with? And there was a lot of non-compliance on all sides, and so that's why these new recommendations came.
Gotcha.
And the principals, under the old wording, kind of, it looked like they had a lot of discretion as to who to inform. It's become very clear who they need to inform, and that it needs to be done every time there's like class change, like on a semester basis, and when they move to the next grade level and to the next school. And in fact, even to the point where it needs to make sure that if records requests are done, then that notification needs to be sent to the next school district as well, so that they can notify appropriately staff members.
I'm wondering, I'm thinking of, in a secondary school, when they're moving between classes and classes, if there are only certain teachers that know, and this student starts grooming or whatever, another student, or approaching another student, and a teacher doesn't know about this record, that might be a problem. So,
And we talked about, we had a district committee that came together and took a look at this, and we talked about the idea that in most cases, that would be like your safety officers, anyone who is in charge of general supervision is probably going to need to know. So like at the elementary level, if any student fell in, like we would probably have very few that at the elementary level, but doing recess supervision. But if there was someone that was doing after school, before school, lunchroom, something like these types of people where there's a lot more interaction in hallways and in other locations. Yeah.
So any other questions or concerns on 3143?
no.
Removing duplicate, second reading and approval.
Okay. Thank you.
So the next is related to previous policies, 3144, release of information in sexual offenders. And this did exactly what you were asking about, Director DeBruler, and talking about the principal's responsibilities with notification of staff, transfer of records. It clarified what student rights and responsibilities were there in terms of protecting the release of information. And it clarified that if the public had questions about this, about a student in a particular building, or those kind of things, that it is not the district's responsibility to respond. Law enforcement, because it is a possibly a criminal act and deals with the legal side of the house, it is their responsibility to respond to that request and notification, not the school district's. And so it places that authority there, so that the school district doesn't have to do it.
So how do, and I've actually seen this happen, so of course, Karen, kind of what you're talking about, letting teachers know, and there have been instances where teachers have shared that information in public settings outside of what is a need-to-know basis.
Yeah.
And it's gotten around, and how is that handled when that happens? How is that handled and addressed?
I mean, that would be an HR type of an issue, because it is.
Or is it handled and addressed?
It's
That's, I guess that'd be
clear
my
when this
question.
information is being shared with staff members, that this is confidential information for you to use, and it is not for you to share
I know it's
with
clear in
others.
there,
Yeah.
but I also know what happens in the staff.
Right.
I've been in there when it's happened, so that's, I
Yeah.
know what happens. And so I'm just wondering, what is the procedure for, because I've not ever seen anything happen to a staff member for doing that. So there's a procedure to, because I've had it happen with teachers sharing about this kid's homeless, so all of these confidential things. And I just wonder if there's a process in place, which might not be for this conversation, but just the process in place for addressing those challenges that happen.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can speak to just HR generally. I mean, we have to address every situation and look at the circumstances regarding that situation, you know, to determine whether discipline is appropriate and what level of discipline would be appropriate. But I can tell you that we are extremely sensitive to the confidentiality requirements related to special education, related to juvenile offenses, and related to free and reduced lunches. That's some of the most sensitive information that we have in the school district, and it's absolutely unacceptable for staff members to be sharing that beyond what the law requires and what the law allows. So we take that responsibility very seriously, and if we were to receive any complaints related to that, we would investigate them on our end and determine the appropriate level of discipline for that individual.
And we continue to educate our staff.
I was just
on
gonna say,
what's appropriate, so it's not just on the punishment side. We continue to remind them of what is appropriate, what
Right.
is need to know.
Yeah.
And it doesn't just apply at work, it is in social settings and other places, and so.
And is it only the sex offender things that need to be shared, or is it all of the other pieces as well? It's what now?
It's all the other ones that
So
were
like
listed in
liquor
the-
offenses and those types of things?
The one that was listed in the previous policy, that's the clarified,
Okay.
if it's that, and they receive a notification from the court.
Okay.
And that's the key, the court is supposed to send those.
Let them have
those
that, let them
out.
have all that information.
Yeah.
But just as a flip question, if a staff member was convicted of a liquor offense or something, then they wouldn't be responsible for notifying the students or family, right?
I think that's what the law says.
And I just said on the flip side, if, you know, if they're required, if a student's been convicted of a liquor offense, or something like that, that the court is required to notify the principal in this. And I just said on the flip side, if a staff member is convicted of a liquor offense, are they required to notify students? Or, because they wouldn't lose their job necessarily, because that's not something that would necessarily, they could go through treatment, they could go, you know what I mean? They could go, so it doesn't apply. I was just because it applies to the students, it doesn't apply to the staff. Correct, that was my question, yeah.
Any other questions for you?
No.
Karen?
No.
Ross? No. Austin? Maya? Maya, any questions on this policy?
Sorry. Yes, I wanted to just say that I appreciate that we're breaking apart the principal responsibilities in the district.
Yeah,
That was all clear.
yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Harmon, this will be another one then, that'll show up for second reading and adoption.
Yes.
On May 3rd, or May 8th.
May
sorry.
8th. So next, we're moving into 3226, interviews and interrogations of students on school premises. This is, it was not listed as a KSD policy, and so it is new to KSD. It has important roots as we think about our students and the relationship between law enforcement agencies and school districts, and clarifying that relationship and recognizing that it's a relationship that must exist, defining who is responsible for which pieces of that, and placing limits on certain actions as well. It also does a nice job of addressing something that I think is a concern for districts like Kent that are diverse, in terms of clarifying the role for all to see of where federal agents are allowed to interrogate and where they're limited in interrogation, and making that clear in policy. But it also states too, I wanted to clarify for the board that that is not the same as identifying Kent School District as a sanctuary district. And the reason why it doesn't go that far is that there are other legal and financial obligations that go along with being labeled as sanctuary. And so that is a different path and different decision if we choose to go there. But it does say, and that is part of the directive that Immigration and Customs agents were given, is that schools and school districts are protected places where interrogation is limited. And if for some other reason that it absolutely must take place at the school or school district, that they are required to notify the superintendent before it can happen. And so it's just clearly stated they are on top of all the other.
Is there in the procedures, is there procedures for how this could happen? So for example, police officers come in and they want to interrogate a student, and then they, put handcuffs on them and walk them to a place in front of everyone or in front of other folks. Is there a procedure to how that can happen as far as taking them to a place inconspicuously, or does anything speak to how this happens?
Not as of yet,
Okay.
no.
I think it's something to consider because,
Yeah.
I think we keep that in mind anytime, so outside of any student or even staff member.
Yeah.
I'll give context. About 2 years ago, did meet with one of our parents who happened to be the director for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And that's, again, related to the reason why we had that conversation. The reality is that we want to make sure that our students, staff members who may be of interest, safe, and the expectation based on the rhetoric that was out in public was that agents could come in at any time
yeah,
and remove a student for any reason. That is not the case.
yeah.
Generally speaking, the only time that would happen, A, is if there was a reasonable, probable cause, and likely if the threshold was a felony offense. And aside from that, the superintendent would be notified. One incident.
Are you talking about other police officers?
Exactly. Yeah, so, and it's just, and, you know, I know
And I-
in general, is
and I
there,
will
is there a
let you know-
procedure for
I
that?
will let you know that yes, there are procedures to go along with this. And some
Okay.
of it has to do with the age of the students.
And a
Yeah, I was gonna ask
fence,
about
and
that.
a fence and all of those things, right, yeah.
Whether they're a,
Suspect.
Right.
or a witness. And then the other piece really, the language is in there, and the police officers, the sergeants and others that we vetted this through made it clear if there's a safety issue that we feel like we need to go into a classroom and handcuff someone because of a clear, safety violation, that safety is the primary concern, they're going to continue to do that. However, in other matters, they're going to work with the school to try to make it as inconspicuous as possible. So it's, I think we have good partnerships with our law enforcement. We've worked to try to do that, and they don't have interest in doing that if they don't need to.
Other questions? No. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Maya.
Yes, I have a question. Do we know when was that created the policy? Because they're new to us, but they're new to WASDA.
So it's been on WASDA's books since at least 2013. And so July of 2013 is when it's listed as its revision date. It doesn't have a start date other than it lists other management resource dates of 2001. I can't say with authority and certainty that it was on the books as of 2001, but it definitely goes back to 2013.
Okay, and do they have the associated procedures that come along?
They do have procedure that goes along with it, and I can put it on the informational, their versioning of the procedure as a start for,
We have.
do we have?
We've
Okay.
developed.
Okay.
Yeah, we've developed procedures.
Okay.
Hopefully go
Okay.
along with this.
Do they, because they mentioned they get into the types of interviews of different types of students. But there's something that the last sentence, the last paragraph, do they get into the procedures that determines whether a request complies with some legal case and other applicable laws? Like, I have no idea what that is. I don't know if the board needs to know what that is, but you have a process to say, yes, this complies with that or this doesn't.
And that is unique to the immigration.
Yes, unique
officers.
just to the immigration office.
Yes. And so, yeah.
So I thought that a question regarding this case might come up, so I did a quick read of it beforehand. Essentially, this was a case, if I'm recalling incorrectly, please forgive me, but this was a case in Texas where the federal government tried to deny the school district funding because it wasn't complying with immigration enforcement. And the court ruled that denied students equal protection under the 14th Amendment. So essentially they said that you can't force the school district to comply with that, with those provisions related to essentially, denying students their education if they're undocumented. And so this reference really just kind of gets at that issue.
Okay.
Reinforces the fact we wouldn't have a process to determine who was
Right.
documented.
Right.
Right, can't ask the questions. Yeah.
And when WASDA talked about the update of this, the last update, it was because they see this as the work of the school district is the same and the requirements to educate students are the same regardless of status.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
So Maya, did that answer your question?
I had a hard time hearing. I was a bit.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so any other questions on this policy?
No, not for me.
Had, it might be a little bit not related, but this is making me think back to a conversation I had with a new student at KSD way back, like beginning of my 10th grade year, and she was a transfer student, she came in. And I don't remember what happened, but there was this incident where she had to have an interview with the KSD security guard. So not in this case, like a federal ICE agent. But that whole situation right there made her feel very uncomfortable, and also made her, it had very strong impact on her. And I just went to the policies page on the board, and there's no policies whatsoever about, I don't want to criticize, but there's no current policy about any policy or the procedure about how KSD employees, such as KSD security guards, conduct interviews or interrogations. And I'm not necessarily saying it needs to be a grade one, but I think that is a very important thing to be considered when there's a lot of students who half the time don't necessarily know that some KSD security guards are actually police officers who come in and volunteer slash, I don't know what the exact relationship is, but are in the schools, but they're also technically also what we city can. And the fact that there's no current policy or even a procedure, on how to limit the impact on the student or how to, because she ended up talking to multiple students about this because she needed support and because her parents had no idea what to do because there was no policy or procedure about any interrogations by KSD security guards.
Are they notified that they should, so my thought is that students are notified that they can have a trusted adult with them, right? When they're doing,
With the interviews with the.
with security
police.
guards or with
With the police,
or safety?
this procedure lays a little bit about parental notification and the procedures go into that around police officers.
Okay.
Safety officers are, our security officers are just another school employee.
Yeah.
And so there would not be the same level. I will say, when you get to see the new discipline policies and procedures that will be being rolled out, there's some more language around informing students up front around their parents' involvement when it looks like there might be a suspension involved. So, and that would be for any case, the employee who's doing that investigation.
Or is it just when there might be, or is it when the student says, I'm uncomfortable, I would like a trusted adult with me during this conversation? Is that, because that's kind of the way that I've known it to work, is that, huh?
If that's stated, if a student says that.
But is our students
Do they know
notified
that?
that they
Yeah.
can state it? Because our students notified that they can say, if you would like a trusted adult with you for this conversation, then you can have that. It's not all the time. That's why, so
It varies
I
and varies, which is
wonder
why I think
if that's,
that right, I'm gonna write that down because I think that should be something that should be put in the policy.
yeah, I
And
don't
it should be
disagree with you.
applied to every single building.
And Randy, what you said too, and going back to what Austin said, if we've got students who are new to the country or new to the district, whatever,
Right.
and
They
they
might
see
not
somebody
know
in
that.
uniform,
Right.
that safety officer
Doesn't
could be a
represent safety
policeman
for
to
them.
that person and still,
Right. And they don't always represent safety to everybody. I
Yeah.
mean, everybody that sees them in uniform doesn't,
yeah.
that doesn't mean
uniform-
they're safe.
Yeah,
Because people
uniform
have had
could-
different experiences. So I agree with you, Austin. I think it's great that you brought that up.
Would that be more applicable to the discipline policy or just?
Yeah, I don't know.
Because we're talking about policies of how employees do their jobs. I don't know that we have, that's not really a policy area. Unless there is.
I guess my question is, and that would probably be a procedure, but in this case, it probably isn't necessarily a work procedure. But even then, it's not, if I go to policies and I type in the search after policy and I just type in interview, nothing comes up about students or even notifying students of their rights that they have if they're called into questioning by any security guard. Nothing about that.
Well, do we need a policy that separates security guards from other staff?
Maybe.
Because then it could be discipline, again, I don't know all discipline policies, so discipline could cover, like you said, guidelines for any involved staff member, safety services officer, principal, whoever. And so is it, if it's covered in there, is it important in the discipline, or are we interested in anything unrelated to discipline? just
Yeah, because it
general
could be
inquiry?
asking a kid about another kid's behavior or activity. It could be asking a kid, I mean, there are other conversations, I think, that are uncomfortable for kids
Right,
at times. And
outside
I
of
think that,
discipline.
and so I think that is something that should be taken into consideration.
I'm saying, just to be clear, or outside of discipline, or disciplinary situation that does not involve the staff. You said only when it involves.
No, because what if a student says, my teacher did this to me, or something happened in the classroom? I think it should be shared with, I think it should be something that's shared with the student that they can do that. Because it's harder, I think, sometimes for them to discuss what happened with adults than it is with kids, so, other kids, so just
Be more about obligations of the district to
ensure the
inform
safety and
student.
comfort
Yeah,
of
yeah.
kids when
Okay.
they're, or to make sure the kids feel safe or can have a trusted adult with them when they're talking with other adults
Gotcha.
about sensitive subjects or things that may be sensitive to them.
So the second paragraph of the current policy that we're discussing, 3226, talks about a couple of the things that you're talking about. So it talks about interviews of students at school, whether they are school-initiated interviews or investigations. So it doesn't say related to discipline or related to this. It is anytime there's an on-site school-initiated interview. So a student is saying something or a district staff is asking about something, that the district will utilize the procedures and protocols associated with this policy to determine next steps. And so that's what this currently says. So I think that then the place for this might be to call it out. Randy, we can work together to call it out in procedure related to this policy, and then that is not just for discipline, it's not just for,
Right.
it shows up when anyone would then do a search in policy around interviews or interrogations. The procedure would show up, and it would have language in it about a student's rights. Might be the
And
section of
so-
what this is starting to look
But
for.
does this specifically refer to, because as I've read this, it specifically refers to law enforcement, DCYF, and the county health department. Those are the three agencies that it refers to in the first paragraph. So is that, so, and it's okay, I'm just saying, are there, so not limiting it to that?
Yeah.
Because it seems to limit it to those interactions.
I think we need to go back and explore where it would most,
Okay.
I think
Where it
we're
fits.
understanding
Yeah,
what you're
where it
saying.
fits.
Yeah,
The thing is,
where-
we
where
need to
does
really
it
go back
appropriate
and look
place
and see
to
where
put
is
it?
the appropriate
Yeah.
place to put something like that. Yeah.
But I think putting it just in discipline doesn't speak to.
No, because it
No,
doesn't say.
Right.
Yeah, I think we need to
So
look
we
and
just-
see where that might fit further. Yeah.
So I think what I hear is that this will likely be a second reading for our next policy work session and will not show up, because we'd spend quite a bit of time discussing that
Yeah.
during a board regular meeting, and you're likely to take action at the next one either, because you want to continue to discuss this. So I would say that this will be a work session, second reading.
That's a good idea.
Everybody agree with that?
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
Use of reasonable force. So mostly this is an update of the legal references. There were some revisions, and it's because a little bit of our policy was slightly outdated, so it's not so much that it's brand new legal reference and RCW and WAC changes, it's just we needed to update them to align with current law. Again, I think when the laws were updated, they did this specific list of prohibited activities rather than referring to the law, so it calls out specific activities again. And really emphasizes the use of, or the prohibition, the use of reasonable force for our special education students.
But then there's a statement there, the physical force, mechanical restraint, chemical spray, or less than which devices will not be used. Do you know what that means, the less than lethal devices?
Less than lethal or legal use of
Lethal.
Lethal is.
That's illegal. Yeah, it's on page 2.
So like a stun gun, stun guns, or
Tasers.
tasers, yeah.
Going to,
Well-
wouldn't end the life of an individual
Well,
technically.
Under
Technically.
typical
Because
circumstances.
under typical
Well, I
circumstances,
think
right.
what they're saying is that we can use some of these things, like physical force, mechanical restraints, chemical spray, to de-escalate a situation. However, we cannot use it as a form of discipline or punishment. And so that's what they're distinguishing. Even though we say that we can legally use some of these things in order to help de-escalate a situation, we can't use it as a punishment.
I am just asking what that means, but less than lethal
Oh, okay.
devices. Less than lethal.
Yeah, so it'd be
So I'm just curious,
tasers,
Who is able to use these items?
That is-
Authorized and trained district staff. Not sure
And
what
is
that
there a,
means.
okay, so that's my question. So
Yeah.
is there, I'm just curious,
Yes,
just, so,
safety services.
is it,
They're the ones that are
they're the ones who
authorized.
can, so,
Well, certain devices, and that's what we're
Right,
called
got
out
it,
in there. And
got
so,
it, okay, and the
students,
procedures.
I mean, we're using different holds and different things like that.
Sure.
That would be people that were trained in our right response. And,
okay.
yeah.
And that's called on the procedures, who can use what and what that looks like? Who's trained to use which items and which devices? Okay. Maya, I don't know if you heard that, so that who is actually able to use the devices is actually called out in procedure. Other questions on this policy? Awesome. Karen? I'm good. Yeah, she's still looking.
Yeah, just, I mean, it's,
It's an unfortunate policy.
yeah.
Let's go through.
Use, restraint, isolation, and other forms of reasonable force may be used on any student when reasonably necessary. So that's including students with IEPs, et cetera, if there's imminent danger for self or others or property. Okay, but it would have to be judicious. Yeah.
Maya, any questions?
No, I'm good.
If this one could go.
Second reading,
Second
yeah.
reading and adoption. Yeah, yes.
Yeah, we'll do second reading now, the procedures to go along with it, because I think that's the important that we're able to see all the content for students in practice.
Absolutely. We can add the procedures for each of these to the informational section. I'm always hesitant to do it with a first reading because there tend to be changes at a first reading, and so then procedures are
Affect the
changed
procedures,
based
right.
on, so, absolutely.
Thank you.
So next is policy 1400. Meeting conduct, order of business, and quorum. And this is not a new policy for KSD, it just defines what actions are taken at different points in different meetings for our board. It talks about special meetings and the required notice piece. Some of those pieces, because our policy was outdated, we were complying with the practice and with the law already. It just was not written into policy. It's like the 24-hour notification, electronic notification, those are things that we were doing. We just needed to be more explicit in doing some of that. It also talked about quorum and voting and being able to vote electronically and using that as an option. Again, things that in practices that we were doing, they just were not listed in policy. They're aligned with what is appropriate. And then it got into a section that was never included in any of ours about public attendance and comment. And it talked about the purpose of public attendance and comment. WASDA in their legal updates did some discussion of different points, the importance of different points of the meeting are subject to different interpretations of public comment. So for example, the limiting of topic and scope under agenda items versus the public comment section of the board meeting. And so this reflects absolute WASDA model policy. And so I say that because I know that there will be changes. There was a line in here that talks about the public comment section happening at the beginning
Yeah,
of the
I saw
meetings.
that.
Ours does not. We know it happens at the end of a meeting. But I wanted to show you what WASDA model policy looks like, and then we can move from there. Because this entire section was new to KSD, I wanted you to see it kind of whole. It also provides some limits around inappropriate language, and it's what President Vengadaslam often gives at the beginning of our public meetings and our regular meetings about inappropriate language and those kinds of things, but it just lays it out in policy as well.
I'm thinking.
So, go ahead. Yeah. Erin?
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty sure in here, I'm not on the wrong policy, that the agenda is to be set by the president and the superintendent, and we've gotten away from that, and I am going to push saying that I think we need to do that.
So I'm going to encourage that you table that for one more policy, that's 1420.
Okay.
That's next.
I was on the wrong one
Nope.
again.
That's okay.
Yeah,
That's next.
okay.
All right, Maya?
Yeah, I just, I also noticed that the second sentence on page 4, second paragraph, sorry, under public attendance, that the board will provide a period at the beginning of the meeting during which visitors can address the board on any topic. We probably should start by, what we have been doing is that the agenda items, at that time they can speak, and then we have the communication from the audience. So I know this is taken verbatim from BoardDocs, but that hasn't been our practice, so we do need to clarify that.
Well, I could definitely see the
Agenda
benefit.
items and communication from the audience.
So the benefit that I see of that is oftentimes, so I'm starting with the first sentence, the board recognizes the value of public comment on educational issues and the importance of involving members of the public in its meetings. So I think that if public comments provided at the beginning of the meetings, it is something that is taken into consideration during our discussion time.
And I kind of think that's why we put where they could talk about an agenda item at the
Prior
time of the
to.
agenda, prior to. Because if you had, say, if you said the first half hour of our meeting will be public comment, right? We've had public comment sometimes that's lasted 2 or 3 hours.
Sure.
And
Right.
If you had that at the beginning of the meeting, I think you'd have to be really firm about only the first 30 minutes will we take public comment. And then anything over that you wouldn't hear.
So how would that be different though? Because if it's added at the end or the beginning, 2 hours on the end versus 2 hours on the beginning, what's the difference?
Difference would be, well, not now, but could be limiting the time at which, total time for public comment.
But we don't do it at the end. Why would we do it at the beginning?
Because the point of the meeting is to conduct business,
Right.
and that has to be done
Well, also, I
effectively
think
before
we need
midnight.
to be more stringent in informing the public to keep it on topic of the agenda item and not sway from that particular topic. Because that tends to happen sometimes where they're addressing a lot more than that agenda item.
So then, my next question, is it possible then to limit the public comment only to the agenda items and not have it at the end?
The only thing I bring up with that is there is this phrase at the end which says, within the scope of the board's responsibility. There's a lot of public comment that subjectively, I could say, is outside the board's responsibility, but we just allow it to happen. And so do we want to be more clear on the comments need to address the topic within our scope? The
And I
agenda
think-
is one
yeah.
scope, but any previous agenda is also another scope.
And I think that could happen if it was limited to public comment before the agenda items, because once we get into superintendent, once we get into the end of the agenda, they're not addressing, they might be, but my question is, why wouldn't, if they addressed it at the beginning, why would they need to readdress it at the end? So if they're talking about, do you understand what I'm saying? So if if they want to address on any topic, well, I guess I'd be limiting it. But my thought is if we open it up for the beginning of each agenda item, and the comments are exhausted for that agenda item, then I guess the end of it's for whatever they want to talk about.
Isn't that what we do?
Yeah. I think
Right.
that's kind of what we're
And
doing
so,
here.
but what I'm saying is, so I'm wondering, again, I don't necessarily see the difference between doing it at the beginning and at the end. If it's something I would want to hear, so if there's something I want to take into consideration, I want to hear it before we go
Right.
into that conversation. And if they chose, my thought is if it's something that's a little broader, that might not be very specific to that particular agenda item, then I would, that's what, I'm just trying to figure out how we can share the value of public comment on educational issues and the importance of involving the members in the meetings. I don't know. I'm just trying to see how we can do that with fidelity.
Yeah.
Right.
If it's on the item, the agenda item, that they're
Then we
they're
take it into
welcome. I mean, they put it
consideration,
on the card and we stop and we do it at that point in time. So anything else that's not on the agenda can come at the end of the meeting, because we do have, I mean, this is an open meeting. It's our business, and we need to conduct our business first.
Right.
So I think kind of the language that's on our current card spells out some of that. And so
Yeah.
maybe what we need to do is bring some of that language from our current card into the policy, and so make it really clear that if you're speaking to an agenda item, that you will have that opportunity prior to that agenda item
Right.
being
In
discussed
the
by the
course of the
board.
meeting,
And
yeah.
other general comments would come during our board, or during public comment, which is traditional, or is later in the agenda or something, but something to word it that way so that they have that opportunity.
It would be interesting to hear, so since this is WASDA's policy, it'd be interesting to see if there are districts that do it this way.
There's districts that don't have an open public comment at the end.
But they have it at the beginning,
And
Agenda item specific.
agenda item
I
specific.
just looked up Bellevue School District.
And they do it at the beginning.
They allot 15 minutes at the beginning of the very
Just 15
very
minutes.
first item.
And public comment is not required.
Right.
However, if you have public comment, you cannot limit,
The amount of comments.
you can limit, because you limit the time, yes.
Oh, okay, okay.
You cannot limit the topics. Public comment is truly that.
Got it.
Public comment.
I see what you're
You
saying.
can have some constraints around time and the type of language you use, meaning
Right.
so WASA defines it as, it's not official fighting words.
Mm-hmm.
is what- So, but other than that, it could be related to an agenda item or not an agenda item.
yes, if you have
But
it
you
at
can
the
limit the
beginning,
time.
and if you said you were gonna limit it to 15 minutes, then the first 15 minutes of your meeting, regardless of whether there were any comments, is truly sitting there waiting for people to make a comment. And if you had, in cases where we've had in the past, where we've had, I think our most was 95 comments or something, you would only be taking the first whatever that fit in that
Right,
15
in that 15 minutes,
or
so the
30
5.
minutes. Yeah. So
Okay.
I think it's, in my mind,
Interesting.
it's fair the way that we're doing it, where you allow people to speak to an agenda item, and then we have time at the end. I've often wondered sometimes on really late meetings if we should have a time period at the end. But again, anytime you put that time period on there, then you have to honor that time period. So if you say you're gonna have an hour at the end for public comments, you would sit for an hour while you waited for public comment.
And from a legal perspective, it would be really important to enforce those limits consistently.
Right.
You wouldn't want to bend depending on the topic, because then you get into viewpoint discrimination potentially.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that would be something that would be really important.
And I don't think you would have to do the entire half hour, because I've been in one where they did have a certain amount of time, and then they asked at the end of the meeting for everyone was there, is at the conclusion of public comment, and then they adjourned the meeting.
Yeah, you definitely wouldn't have to sit there
You don't
in
have to sit
silence
there
if
and
you
listen in
allocate
silence. You
30
don't have to do that. Yeah, you don't have to do that, no. No, okay.
So then that is something, so I hear a couple of things in this discussion. I hear that you want more language from our comment card, which is fine for the next reading of this. But I also hear you kind of unresolved on an idea, I think, of either time-bound or not time-bound. I think you've resolved beginning or end. But I think I hear,
I think it's both. Well, so
Yes.
I'll say what I
I'm okay with
reflect,
the
not
end,
necessarily
yeah.
what we
I'm okay
agree.
with the end, but
We
yeah.
like with the idea of people being able to speak on agenda items before the agenda is presented,
Yes.
specifically before we discuss and vote, consistent with current now. I'm interested in setting some kind of time bound on the end, but one that's more just a general time bound to prevent the 1 or 2 times a year it goes like over an hour. So I don't know what that number is, but at least making it clear that communication from the audience will happen at this period, open any topic at the end of the, well, at some point at the end of the meeting, after voting's done, so after business is done. Yeah, do you want to say something?
Yeah, the question on my end would be, would you also want to have a time limit on each individual agenda item? Because that would be, let's say you get 95 comments on one particular agenda item, and then you only have a time limit at the end, and I would want to think about potentially the legal implications of having some open related to agenda items and open, like,
So yeah,
unlimited
to clarify,
comments.
I mean, I'm
Yeah.
interested. I would be open to both. I don't know what those numbers are or anything like that, but also not interested
agree
in
with you.
restricting comment, so it's just more providing a bound on there.
I see what you're saying,
That was
because you
my
could in theory have 45 commenters on an agenda item.
Say adopting a budget.
Right, I would say a budget or a
Right.
financial
Salary
statement
schedules
is you
or-
get,
yes.
okay, you get an unbound
But you would still
topic.
have that 45 at the end of the meeting.
The question would be if they wanted to speak to a specific agenda item.
That's what I
and they-
mean.
Right.
Right, so if they're speaking to the budget, right, or whatever that looks like, whether there are 45 people that signed up to speak to it at the top of the agenda item or at the end, it'd still be the 45 people speaking to it.
Unless we put a time bound on the, so the question is if we put a time bound on the end and say, open public comment is limited to 60 minutes. Well, at 3 minutes each, 45 people can't speak.
Right.
So there
20
would be
can speak.
cut off after whoever, the last person after 60 minutes.
Maximum.
But I wouldn't
of-
agree with cutting, so I understand what you're saying. And so
Right.
I would actually be open with kind of, I guess what you're saying, just leaving it no time limit at the beginning of the agenda item for those couple of times where we might, and then setting a limitation at the end. That was what I would be on board with.
I guess my only concern with that would be, is I think Maya was the one who said it, that sometimes people will come and they say they're going to speak to X on the agenda item, but pretty soon they're talking about 5 other things.
Well, then I
So
think-
who's ever,
Yeah.
the board would have to be really good
Yes.
about then stopping someone from continuing to speak if it was not on that agenda item, and ask that the rest of their comments be put
Saved,
later in the
yeah.
meeting.
Now, if that's,
I don't
put
think we
in
could do that.
policy.
We can't do that. We can't tell them what to talk about, even if they didn't address, even if they, we can't.
The specific topic
Can we?
items.
If during an agenda item,
The agenda item.
Yeah, if it's specific to the agenda item.
So what if they come in after? Okay, I wasn't
So-
aware of that. I didn't think you could tell them what they could say.
That is it's a strategy, and it's also the part of the practice. If we're going to
Be
provide
effective.
open comment on an agenda item, we want to make sure it's focused on that agenda item, because again, the strategy is, I'll say I'm talking about underwater basket weaving, but what I really want to talk about is this. And
Yeah.
That's
That's interesting. I didn't realize we could do that.
under Washington Model Policy and under the policy update for this particular policy, it talks about the differentiation between an agenda item and the agenda item section of your board agenda and the public comment section. And the difference is whether or not it is truly an open public forum or a limited public forum. And the agenda section is a limited public forum.
Got it.
And that means that you can limit the topics to those items on the agenda in the same way that you all are not allowed to take action or discuss items outside of what's posted on the agenda.
Got it.
During that section,
Right.
the public cannot come in and provide commentary around that section. That's why there's a public comment section for those items or areas later.
Dr. Harvey makes a point
that's-
that we all need to be reminded of, and I heard you, Karen, I think I understood what you meant, but I thought I heard what you said, it's an open public meeting. And while it may feel that way sometimes, it technically is a board meeting that's held in public.
On the open, yeah, that's what I
Held
meant.
in the
I
Yeah.
know what you meant,
Yeah.
but what some individuals
Yeah.
believe is that it is an open public meeting,
Right.
meaning that I can come in and say whatever I want
Yeah.
for however long I want. We want to provide each community member with the opportunity to share, that's where equality comes in.
Right.
That's why we have our
I can take a deeper look to see what, it may not show up in policy for other districts, it may show up in their procedures in terms
Yeah.
around public comment the next go around. And so the next version will incorporate more of our note card language for sign up. And then we'll bring some information around what other districts are doing.
I have one other question on it, was on, at the beginning, where we're talking about, like under regular meetings and the 24-hour notice, do we really need, unless the district does not have a website or employees fewer than
10,
ten
yes.
equivalent
Please
employees?
take that off.
No, we do not. I brought you raw,
Right,
the raw
exactly
update
what
of,
it said.
you
It
know,
just
there's,
felt like it's like we have way more than.
and yes, we have a website.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering if we could strike that.
Yeah. Is there a case,
Are we on 1420 or are we still on?
We're
Still
1400.
1,400.
So I do have one more question, so I'm reading it. Oh, go ahead, Maya. It says, "The board will provide a period at the beginning of the meeting during which visitors may address the board on any topic within the scope of the board's responsibility." Are we going to put language in that specifically speaks to our agenda item structure?
So that's where our note card items are coming in. And so what
So
you
that
said at the
language will
beginning
come
is
into
that-
here.
Yes, and so
Okay.
what I heard you say, and what I thought I was going to incorporate, was that the structure and order of public comment wasn't going to change, meaning that you wanted to keep agenda items first and public comment at the end.
Is that what our policy says? Because I don't see that in here.
So this is
what it
what's
will
the model policy. What
Oh.
it will say for next reading will be what I've heard you all
Okay.
just
That's what
discuss.
we have been
I thought
doing,
this is
yeah.
what you added to, I'm sorry, I'm looking through it, because so this was not our policy. That has the strike-throughs and changes, that added WASDA language.
So the strike-throughs were our current policy. The red language is new WASDA model policy.
Got it, I see what you're saying, okay. So then, we didn't have anything speaking to that in
No.
our policy. That's,
No.
okay, that's
No,
what
no,
I'm
that's
saying.
why it's all rated, yes.
Got it, okay, so that's what I thought that was what was happening.
So the no, we're gonna change.
In our own policy, we will add.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I meant.
And so
Thank
the
you.
next time you see this, it will reflect more of KSD
Got it.
in the public
Perfect.
comment section.
Yeah.
And again, some information around what other districts are doing. And it will strike language that is not applicable to Kent School District, like the website and the 10 district employees.
And the language I'm getting at within the scope of the board's responsibility is essentially just kind of stopping people from coming in and ranting and raving about things that you have no control over. I mean, maybe they are very, important comments that one would make, but, for instance, coming in here and complaining about the President of the United States of America, it's not anything you can do anything about.
And I guess one other quick thing, does it spell out what type of meetings, or be a regular board meeting? I just thought it says the beginning of the meeting, but does it say that the beginning of a regular board meeting? Are you saying yes, Maya, it does, or yes, it should?
No, I'm looking at 1420.
We're not there yet.
It says board meetings at the top. It does say board meetings at the top, right under public attendance and comment.
We've done this for
we do
special
agendas
meetings
For
occasionally.
special meetings. Yeah, for work sessions and special meetings, we do have agendas.
With executive session, we don't post, usually, that's posted within 24 hours. We don't post it the Friday before the.
14.
Oh, okay. So hang on just a minute, Maya, you're on 1420, and we're still on 1400.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I'm there too.
Okay, so, and Karen's on 1420, so I just want to make sure. So on public comment.
The
on
first
public
line says
comment
board
and
meetings,
attendance,
but not regular. I see what you're saying.
Yeah, can we make it clear that that's regular board meetings, please?
Yeah.
Okay. All right,
Make
so
them regular board meetings.
1400 is going to come back for a second reading before it goes on.
Yes, it's gonna show up at the next work session, and we'll look at those dates right at the end of this, rather than,
There's one sentence at the very end talking about requiring the opportunity for public comment on any policy that we adopt or amend that's not required or implied by law. Do we have those? This is more of a general question. Do we have those? If so, what scope are they, and can we know which ones that we have to require public comment on, and a policy that's required by law, just go through? Or is there no distinction since we're always doing this in a public meeting?
so you are really testing my memory on this one. So yes, we do
There
have
are
policies
some
that are not required by law, so that's
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
To be able to rattle one off for you, right, I can't say, but I know that we do.
Yeah.
We have some, and I say not only not required by law, that don't even show up as WASDA model policy. They're
Right.
truly a Kent policy, and that would be an example of something that is a.
Your racial equity
Sure.
policy.
So race and equity, right, it's a great
equity
one.
policy.
Not
Race and
required,
equity.
That's
yeah,
not required by law,
Yeah.
right,
Yes.
and so that
That's
one,
a great
yes,
one.
so there are some, yeah.
So I was like, I know we have them.
We
but
do.
I was
This is
like,
where it
okay,
says-
wait.
Yeah, we do.
Go ahead.
And so you're essentially allowing for that comment already in the way that you
That's what
you conduct your
yeah.
meetings by allowing for people to speak to specific agenda items.
Okay.
And I think that grouping would probably be broader than we might believe is true, because I'm not sure that, for instance, we have, policies on the Open Public Meetings Act, saying that we're going to follow it. I don't know that there's a law that says we need to adopt a policy that we're going to say we're going to follow it.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
it's the law, right? We do it for clarity's sake and for communication
Our
with the
complaints against
public.
employee policy isn't a law policy, is it? Is it legal?
So I have a great one.
Yeah.
Policy 6022, minimum fund balance.
Oh, that's not legally required.
It's not required by
Not
law,
required
there's
by law.
nothing, in
Right.
fact, that's one of the notes up there, is that it's not required under any statute. When we
Yeah.
get to that one.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that it's not required, but we, like you said, for clarity,
Right.
transparency, reflect district beliefs.
Okay. Well, that's fine. That was it. That was my last one.
Okay, so 1400 is coming to the next work session for a second reading.
Yes.
And now we're going to get to 1420.
Yes.
Okay.
The, Dr. Herman, did you want to say anything about it? I know Maya's got some comments and Karen's got-
Nope, I think that we're ready to dive in, and they've been waiting, so go ahead.
All right, so Maya, go ahead. 1420.
Yeah, nothing as agenda. I didn't do like the proposed agenda session, so for agenda, it doesn't speak for all meetings, just it should be only regular meetings, so just a clarification there. That's all. I thought that's what you were referring to, Debbie.
Oh, okay. So you're saying for the proposed agenda that it should be the regular,
Yeah.
Yeah, the agenda available
yeah.
online the Friday evening preceding the school board meeting. It should probably say the regular.
Regular board
Okay.
meetings.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Karen?
Yeah, and again, in that first sentence, it says the board secretary shall be responsible for preparing the agenda for each meeting in accordance with the president. We've gotten away from that, and I want to push back strongly that we need to do that again, and even possibly add the vice president to the two
So
Two
what if-
officers meeting.
What if other board members have things that they'd like to add to the agenda?
Then you talk to the president and the vice president prior to the setting of the agenda.
Right. So there's no specific agenda policy for that.
And I
And I-
had it before though, the
Well,
board said that.
I would say not.
Oh, it's
I would just
in-
say not
It's
here.
in protocol.
Yeah, it's probably.
Like, I know we have it. It's in
Yeah.
protocol where it says that, if there's other things you would want, that you would notify, I believe it says the president
Yeah.
and the superintendent,
Got it.
that you would like those on prior to that. But-
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question. So I think about, is there a request sent out to the board for agenda items? Because I think that would be something that would be helpful. Because I think sometimes what happens is, oh, go ahead, Maya.
Oh, she's what,
Oh, I said, is there a process for sending out a request for agenda items to the board members? Because I think that would be helpful.
I would say it depends. Like something like presentations, I think that's part of our calendar. But you're asking for actual approval, things to motion and approve.
Well, I think the things we add to our calendar are the things that we've asked to be added to our calendar, but we can also, well, what I don't want to do is limit our entire year of meetings to things that are on our calendar.
Right.
So I think that there should be leeway, because it is they are board meetings of the board, so we should have input as to if we wanted to add something to an agenda. So I'm saying, is it possible to get a request for agenda items to be added to the board meeting?
And I think
To us, that way we would have, so it just comes to the school board, and we could then send it to the board president or send it to, so there's a process in place. Because there's no process, so when you say you can just tell the president, what does that mean? Do I call and say, hey, I want this added to the agenda? Do I send an email? What's the process? And I think we should have a formalized process so that we know how to get that information.
So we do have a process for the agenda setting. Karen certainly work closely with the president or vice president. I think we can talk about what makes sense for example.
Yeah.
You can give an example of a policy or an agenda item you would want us to either consider or.
Well, there could be, I mean, it could be anything. So for example, I am interested in adding a plan for addressing the discipline disproportionality. I want to see that. And so that would be something I would ask be added to an agenda in the future. So I'm saying, so anything, I mean, anything.
Well, no, because not because I think anything, but anything as in like, you want an open period where board members can make motions and see if they're seconded.
Not at all.
Like
I
put out
want-
an
not at all.
ordinance or put out a decree.
No,
So
not at
that's
all.
not actual board,
Not
that's
at
board
all.
action. So you're not
That's
asking board action.
That's not what I'm asking for. I'm just asking to have something that we can either be presented, if it's a presentation, or something that maybe needs to be discussed. Whatever that is, I'm just saying that. I
That's
think
where I
that-
said, but that's not the board's, action. The general meeting is, the purpose of the general meeting, and general meeting only, is to take the action on the items.
It's
That
also
can
to have
happen.
discussion on items, and it's also to follow up on items. So if I ask, if there's something presented and I want follow-up on it, I can ask for it to be added to the next meeting. So that's not entirely true.
Well, no, but that's not what the purpose of the meeting is. The purpose of the meeting isn't to ask for more things in future meetings, I guess is what I'm saying.
Where would you get that?
I'm trying to reflect what you just said.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm wondering, why would you say what you just said? Why would you, I mean,
So the purpose
where
of
is
the
idea?
general meeting is
Right.
to actually take action. Board votes on stuff, board makes motions. Now, we, as it's set up, we only make motions, at least as it is, on things that are on the agenda. Something like presentations, frankly, is a nice to have in the general meeting, because it's not, there's no action being taken, it's just informational. We can ask
Right.
questions, we can ask for follow-up, but that follow-up doesn't have to come through an action in the general meeting.
But
It
that's
could have come
where-
in a work session, it could come through an email.
It
There's
could.
no agenda requirement that we take an action on it in there. And so when I think about the proposed agenda,
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to clarify whether your concern is the ability to take board action in a general meeting,
No.
or hear about things that the board is interested in and get follow-up and ask questions on certain topics,
That aren't on the calendar.
which isn't specific to a general meeting agenda.
May I try to refresh
Please.
really quick?
Yeah.
So I think, I'm hearing both, and then I think,
Mhm.
so I believe, Janice, what you were trying to say is if, we'll take discipline and disproportionality
Yeah,
as
yeah.
an example. So asking for an additional presentation or additional information on exactly what steps
Exactly.
are being taken.
Correct.
So it may not be able to, so that would be a request that would come in to Dr. Watts, and he would say, okay, yes, we can have that presentation for you on this day to be able
Exactly.
to do that. So not necessarily something that would require another action, but the ability to be able to request further information on something that we have heard about.
Or if there's something we haven't heard about
That you
that
would
we
like
want
to
to
hear about.
get information on.
And here's a perfect example of what would drive a typical one-on-one, two-by-two conversation. It would be just that. Are there any topics of discussion, is there anything that's happening in your purview that you have been wondering or noticing that we can follow up on as immediately as we can, researching and gathering information, or in an upcoming board meeting for a presentation, for example. That would be an opportunity to share. Because at the end of the day, what we'd like to see is a calendaring process that does have some flexibility, but for the most part, we would like to include certainly obviously our board, staff, and the reason for that is because there's context regarding what presentations make sense, give us an opportunity to plan and present so that it is ready for the appropriate board meeting. It doesn't mean that's the only information that you want to use.
Right. And I think about like student recognitions, right? I think about, so we will have students who are recognized as Student of the Month, and we will bring them to board. That's not something you could I mean, you could have space, but for example, if we have a team that wins a state championship, well, let's invite them in to come in. I mean, so there are things that we could have added to our agenda, is what I'm saying. And so there should be a process, in my opinion, to do that, whatever that looks
And I
like.
agree, and I think, because that's what, and I wanted to clarify, because
Yeah.
I was on the other side. I think there should be a more open process for board members to propose motions and agenda items.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to clarify if we were talking about the same thing, which we
Yeah.
were not.
Right.
Um,
That's okay, gotcha.
And so.
We're clear.
To that point, I think that's where, right, the calendaring is what it is, because it's like, this is what we'd like. But the sort of like, yeah, we should have the opportunity to prioritize what we want to see, either reprioritize existing things or
Or if something
lift something
comes
that,
up.
so yeah, lift something
then
out of
we can, if
nowhere
something comes
and
up.
say, this is something that we should do. So that's more of a, again, this is other non-school boards have maybe more loose, not really open, elected official boards, but a portion where board members suggest future agenda items. We could or could not vote on it if we wanted to, or we could just suggest it and put it through a prioritization resource process.
And as part of what we currently have, right, so when we're talking about something or when there's a presentation, we have the ability to request to Dr. Watts. It would normally be who's ever presenting, right?
Yes.
But as a board, we have the right to be able to ask Dr. Watts at that time to say, Dr. Watts, we would like to have a follow-up in regards to such and such. And then we would give that charge to him to then have it be there. So that's one way that you could bring something. I would say motions could get a little, depending on what you're doing, because you wouldn't have,
You don't move on everything.
you wouldn't know about everything on site, right? I think, I guess that would.
But this is where, like, this is, again, me as a person being a board member, you know, we should be the ones driving motions if we want to. We're driving it, you know, the business that needs to get done, and there's the things we want to see. So if we were like-minded and we said we want a motion that directs the district to implement this policy, there's a request, there's the right to request, and then there's the formal motion. Having both available, rather than right now, everything is kind of a request process, an unformalized request process, and more either formalizing the request process or using the motion process.
And I think I was
I'm interested
leaning
in the
more towards
extension.
formalizing the request process.
Yes.
So,
Meaning that we make a request, it's documented, and there is an answer. We will or
Right.
will not do this,
Right.
and this is when it will
Right.
happen.
Okay. Maya?
Yeah, I'm hearing Denise say something to the effect of, well, we have structure with our agenda. 6 different sections of the agenda, and if there are areas where, there are presentations that we would like to see, if there are discussions and motions to make, if there are areas where we would like something to be discussed, or I think all of us have the opportunity to say that we'd like to see this on the agenda. So that could be a process we go through prior week of the board meeting, where we just openly ask, are there things for discussion or presentation?
So Maya, are you saying then, as part of our regular board meeting, so say our meeting on the 8th, that one of the things that we add somewhere, whether it be at beginning of board discussion or somewhere, would be, is there anything that the board would like to see added to an upcoming board meeting for discussion?
Right, we could do that, or, just what we've been doing is sending information to Dr. Watts, or on the meeting will say, I'd like to be presented, or something to that effect. I send information to Dr. Watts as well, I'd like to see this on the agenda. So, and I don't know if that's the way to do it at the board meeting, but I think an opportunity where we are requested to give information on those 5 or 6 sections. What is it that you would like to see in the upcoming board meeting? I think that's what Denise, you're asking for.
it is, and I think, and it doesn't have to be, don't get me wrong, it's not like we would request something for the next board meeting and expect you to jump in, because reasonable, just to be reasonable, I think but my concern is there's no formal process. So, that's the thing, so if, I would like to see a process to where, for example, if there's something we wanted added, we would need to get it to Maya or you, or whatever that looks like, in writing though, because I think it's important that we do it in writing. And then, we could request that it be added, but there's no process, and so I don't feel like having to, catch somebody on a 101 or having to make a phone call is a process. So I think there should be just a more formalized process, a request for agenda items.
And I think, and I appreciate that. I think it could be part of a process, and here's one thing I can think about. At least having an opportunity to have the conversation. Maybe something that has just come up, so we can talk about it before, because I can see on the other hand, if you have an idea or a thought, then you send it to me, and then I have context that leads us to the realization that this may not be something that we can do in this way, but here's another way.
Absolutely.
I think that's really the only reason why we want to begin that process with a conversation, so that we can have full context. But I think right now we know there needs to be a process, and I think we can, the minds can come together and come up with a clear process so that it is understood, it's reasonable, and it gets the information that you're school board director looking for.
If we could add it more, rather than in a policy, if we could add it to like our protocol. right, make it part of our, because if it was in our protocol as to what the steps may be clearer that way. I guess in some ways I kind of think, you know, we should be, if we know that this is the protocol and this is how we're going to add things that way, I'm not necessarily sure we'd have to have somebody remind us every week that we need to do it. I think if we've agreed to that, then maybe that could be that, but to be able to add it a little bit more that way.
So one thing I'm kind of hearing is kind of, I guess, like a formal request process. And I think when I look at the board agenda for the last meeting, and the communication portion is, as far as I'm aware, has always been the same. We have student representative report, communication from the audience, legislative update, superintendent's report, and board open discussion. And I think that's right there is board reports and discussion. Because so far my experience has been, we all give, each of the board members gives their own perspectives and they give their own report, but I haven't really seen any specific discussion happening during the last 10 minutes. And I think that might be right there, might be an opportunity where at the end of the board meeting, maybe Maya as the president says, here is 2 or 3 requests that we ask you put on our next board meeting based on what board members have said at following this presentation on disproportionality. We're going to ask Dr. Watts that for our next board meeting, we add this presentation. I think that right there would also be a really good, like, maybe transparency thing, because it also lets anyone who's in the audience and anyone who watches the live stream know that the board is going to have to take on this task and follow up on this. So I just board reports and discussion. So.
All right, so it sounds like there's probably more discussion on this. It's not necessarily directly related to the policy, but it's been good discussion. So that may be something we want to add to a future board discussion, because I know we'll come up against protocol will be something that we'll need to review again. And so that would be a great opportunity for some of that.
But what I do hear is there's enough discussion around this and some changes that this will be a second reading for a work session and likely not going to show up on May 8th as a second reading and adoption.
Okay.
So last but not least, this one will likely be a continuation, is our minimum fund balance policy. And so this one was very interesting for me because there's WASDA model policy around it, and it is encouraged. It is not essential. It is not required under any statute that there be minimum fund balance policy for a district. Most importantly, though, I would say if we're going to keep it, we should align it with WASDA's numbering, and we need to change our numbering so that it aligns, if nothing else. And so because there's not really any statute or anything requiring a minimum fund balance policy, WASDA does a lovely job crafting language around it, but does not fill in the important box and blank that has been the topic of discussion at many board meetings and amongst you all as board members. And so what you have as handouts, I tried to anticipate your questions of, well, what are others doing? And so on that first sheet, you have a list of what I would say are near neighbors across the Puget Sound region, and then some of our size neighbors. So I tend to always include Lake Washington and Evergreen, even though they are not necessarily close to us. They are size alikes typically. And so I throw them into this as well. And so what you see is an interesting mix of districts who have a fund balance policy and those that don't. I summarized it. So there are 6 with no fund balance policy. There are 6 with a fund balance requirement, and then it's typically a range. So some it's 3 to 5%, some it's 5 to 6%. One it's 5 to 8%, and only one calls out an exact percentage of 5%. The other has a language around an annual percentage reflected in the budget, is what Renton says. It's interesting. The language does not call out 3%, 2%, or whatever. It says that it will be reflected in their annual budget. So that means that each year they set.
It's based on
Right.
their budget.
It's based on their
What they
budget.
have, right.
So that is interesting. So that kind of led me down this path of, well, what's the purpose of a fund balance? And so what is the purpose? Purpose of fund balance is to sustain the district operations when we do not take in the revenue from anticipated sources. So if something were to happen, I'll give you an example. So in another state, there was a debate about the tax rates for property values. And so the county made a decision about reassessing property values after school districts already set their budgets. So the school districts believe that they are going to collect this based on property values. And the county made a decision not thinking about school districts and their funding being dependent upon that. And now there's this gap. So that's an example of our funding and revenues not being aligned with what our expenditure plan was. And that would be a case. Or if something catastrophic happened and for whatever reason the state apportionment got lost in the cloud of electronic fund transfers, we would have enough budget to make payroll, sustain the operations of the district through general fund. Emergencies, all of those things. And so that got me thinking then, okay, if that's the purpose, then is it a percentage we're chasing or a number of days of operation that we're looking for? Meaning that the fund balance is designed to keep the district afloat for what period of time? Is it 1 week, 5 weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 months? What is that belief? Because the 5% for each of these districts is always related to the expenditures, either the previous expenditures of the previous year or projected expenditures for the current budget, is how it's stated. So I asked Sean to take a look and said, well, is there anything that legally prevents us from using this kind of time-bound estimate? And there isn't. So it could be. And so then I looked at, in doing this, she also looked at the other districts and what their policy stated. She found Puyallups, and so you have Puyallups, and Puyallup does exactly that. Their fund balance is designed to keep the district afloat for 13 to 15 days. And I'm not suggesting that we use 13 to 15 days, but what it says is 15 days is 3 work weeks of a district. So it's 3/4 of an operational month. And that's what they said. And so that it is never dependent upon what the expenditures were the previous year, the expenditures were the next year. It's, okay, if we built a budget that is this, and it takes this to operate the district per day, then we need our fund balance to reflect between 13 and 15 days of operation.
So what happens, though, if something happens where you expend that fund balance? So then so getting back to, right? And so during that process, what does that look like? We're going to be out of compliance if we're not? So I guess my thought is, well, you can go ahead, because we'd be out of compliance until who knows when, right? Depending on the whatever that is.
So, I'm trying to think. I believe it might have been Vancouver, yes, that talks about how the target has to be achieved over a 5-year period. So it speaks to how you get to that fund balance over time. The difficulty is that all of this is policy, and it's not theoretical, it is rule, but it does not make the dollars show up. So whether we pick 3%, 5%, 5 days, 15 days, it does not make dollars appear. That actually is work that happens outside of policy. So that is making the tough choices around budget expenditures. It is about, unfortunately, saying no to certain things. All of that is what it takes, no different than a household budget, to get back on float. But that is not, so you can talk about what that plan is or the requirement of a plan. You can be even more prescriptive in terms of the requirement of certain actions or things that would not take place if you were on the path to if we were on the path to getting back to a particular fund balance. But it's not really, I mean, that part isn't policy work, it's actually.
But what if something happens in the 4th year and we have to expend it again? And then does a 5-year period start over? I mean, so it's kind of ambiguous, right?
Right,
But
that is dependent upon, again, what's the belief system around why you have this, and what is that? And so on the backside of that, I started kind of costing it out. Yeah. So what would it look like if we were to live? And that part was the interesting part for me, because what it said was, wow, we typically said 5%, and so that 5% number for 2019 is not any different than you've heard Ben talk about before. But when I started thinking about our daily rate and started costing that out, a typical month, a work month for a district is about 20 days. 20 days of keeping a month afloat. So you think about, okay, you want enough savings to live a month if something happens. that is actually closer to 8%.
Yeah, $1.5 million per, yeah, that's.
It's closer to 8% than it is 5% or 3%. And so I'm not making necessarily a recommendation or suggestion, I'm just putting it into perspective of what it takes to run and operate the district. And this is just general fund expenditure. So this is not talking about capital or other pieces that happen in conjunction with. This is our day-to-day operations, core business of educating students. So as we continue to do this work, 'cause I didn't think that we would get this settled tonight, I wanted to bring this to you because there's lots of space for us to go next. And I actually put some references because I thought about Director Hardy, who always asks, well, what's the definition, or what is outside our external source say about this? So the Government Finance Officers Association makes some recommendations about, again, not an amount, but the philosophy of what it's for, and are you taking into consideration what's there? So they say 2 months of operations. It's a lot. To be fair, and I'll be honest, Ben has said this, I think, in a regular board meeting, when he was talking about our bond ratings. Moody's and Standard & Poor's prefer 10%. And so it's not, I mean, so I'm not saying that, again, that's the recommendation of what to go, but when you talk about outside operations and industry standards, it is much higher than even what regionally we typically go for. And then OSPI did not make a recommendation, nor did the Washington State Board of Education, but Oregon did. And so I just put Oregon's as our, again, nearest state neighbor, and kind of what their recommendations are to their districts. And there's this nice too, because it talks about the size of the district. So it balances those expectations with considerations for size of the district. And so smaller district, you have a smaller budget, so it takes a larger percentage to operate. But if you really cost out daily what it takes to operate, you start to think about, well, how many days are we going to stay for? And I think then we start to get into the how do we get there, and then how do we stay there. What some of the other policies do, and what ours does, the current policy does a nice job of defining all of the reasons why a fund balance might be necessary, but it doesn't do a good job of talking about the parameters in which you would spend a fund balance.
Right.
And I think that's important moving forward, because if in policy we're clear as a district on when we spend fund balance, then it starts to not become debatable. And clarifying the difference between a one-time expense and recurring cost. And so when you use fund balance for recurring costs like we have in the past, you kind of end up where we are right now.
Right.
And so we have to be clear on that piece as well. So it's not just necessarily picking a particular percentage or amount, it's also identifying then when are the ons and offs of being allowed to use fund balance. And then again, how do you put it back? So what does replacement look like once we've spent?
And making sure we're not violating policy during that time. Because I think that, again, right, it could be, well, you know, it's been 2 months and you guys had to spend your fund balance on this, so you're out of compliance because you don't have it. Or, you know what I'm saying, or just trying to figure out what that looks like.
And that's what the policy is written as.
Right now.
Some of these other policies aren't written as individual month fund balances. Those are irrelevant.
Right.
The actual fund balance is also irrelevant because
Right.
it's talking about the fund balance as part of the budget.
Right.
And so that
Which
we
I
could
actually
go
agree with
away
that.
from what is the actual fund balance in the past, and given our situation, say you should target your budget, your forecast, whatever it is, should target a fund balance. I like the range idea, but without necessarily committing to numbers, but say
Right.
the budget needs to target this. Specifically because we've been under target for so long, the budget should get us to that. And allows the room for, something happens in the budget, we collect less revenue, we're not specifically out of policy just because we didn't get enough revenue.
Right.
But again, I like the idea though of spelling out what you would use the fund balance for and making that clear. I did like in the old policy 6002 where it says exactly what fund balance is, because I know over the years we've had many questions on how it's calculated. So I think that's still important information to get. But you're right, as I reread that one, there is nothing that says why we would spend it or anything like that, which would be helpful in going forward.
So this is
I
just,
think Dr. Harmon might have mentioned this, I couldn't hear clearly, but going back to Dennis' presentation a couple of months ago, they must be used. So should they even be calculated towards the expenditures, where, that if we're doing a percentage of current year's expenditures, should we even look at
Right.
that separately? So really defining expenditures, I think, would be important.
Right, defining that we're not gonna keep a balance of funds we can't keep,
Right,
basically.
exactly,
Right.
right, the expectation, yeah.
I think something to, as someone who's come to board meetings before, I remember last August when you adopted the budget, through a resolution. So what is to say that there needs to be a policy about minimum fund balance? Why can't, as the Puyallup School District does, and they talk about 13 to 15 of the current year's operating expenses, so basically 13 to 15 days. Why can't the board basically set a new minimum fund balance with the budget via an official resolution that you can vote on? Because resolutions are very much the same thing as board giving authority and stating this is what a directive.
I think this is where the policy needs to live beyond a budget cycle. So we haven't met a minimum fund balance for longer than we've had a surplus budget. I think that's where we want to get to, and I think that's where I would want to get to, is say, when we're at a point where we can choose what fund balance size we want, and then we can say the budget defines the minimum fund balance. But I think I like that idea of, that also kind of gets to how and when you could spend your fund balance if you have it.
Because I don't remember what the number was, but I remember in the past month, someone mentioned how in this specific year, KSD had 200 whatever it was students enrolled. I don't know what the number was, but that plays an impact on the budget.
700.
So there you are. And, closer you get to August, and the closer you get to officially adopting the budget for the board meeting, the closer, more specific idea you have of what the fund balance could be. And possibly because that plays in the budget. So.
I think it would be important, though, to make, I like the idea of having it in policy, just because you want things to live on for more than a year. And if we have a vision of how we want our fund balance to be, right, and why we would have a fund balance, then I think it would be important to have that in policy so that it stays year after year, and it's not, oh, well, this year we don't have anything, so it'll be, 3 days or whatever that is. So it sounds like this particular topic is going to need a whole lot more discussion. And I would almost recommend that it maybe is standalone by its own, just because I think there's a whole lot more work to do on this one.
Quite a bit. And so I'll close just with a reminder that on May 8th, even before our regular meeting, we have another 60 minutes. That 60 minutes will likely be the second readings of some of these others. And we may decide to spend maybe the 29th as a session if you want to delve deeply into fund balance alone. We can talk about that at the next meeting of when you'd like to tackle that or how you'd like to move forward with that one as a standalone. But I knew we would. 2 hours? No, we're not, but you've also talked about a system of accounts, and it's a related one that goes along with this, and so we can talk about those two. And I can see easily spending an hour.
Yeah, I think an hour.
On those two.
So, yeah. Okay.
So,
all right. So we are right on time. So thank you, everyone, for your attendance tonight, and we are adjourning.
Thank you.
Welcome back, Maya.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Night, Tim.
So I will talk to you guys on the 8th. Please come.
Okay.
I'll be floating on the screen.
Floating head.
Floating head again on the 8th, but it's been nice to see you a few times.
I know,
in person.
right?
Yeah, it was supposed to be a lighter brown. And in order to do that with such a dark hair color,
Uh-oh, you got it.
my hairdresser, in order with my dark hair color, first you bleach it before you
need to
put
lift
it
it
on,
and then
it
deposit.
up. But she had 2 clients come in right as I ended, so she's like, you can come back and you can have, and we can finish it.
probably healthier on your hair too, to let it recover a little bit, because they're lifting all of it out, that's damage.
So are you going a natural color but lighter?
Yeah,
than-
just like a lighter brown.
Oh, okay.
No, like
Yeah,
black.
We're not going green or blue or anything.
Yeah,
It's not
no.
necessarily bad, it's just a
No.
change.
Yeah, but,
I switched versus